I am Stødle. I work at Webstep Stødle in Norway. And today I'm going to talk to you about Svelte. Svelte isn't a brand new framework. It's currently at version 3, but it got a bit of an overhaul last year with some very nice improvements, which has made it more relevant than it was before, I would say. It is a component framework, much in the same vein as React or Vue, but has a focus on being very performant at runtime and minimizing the amount of code you have to write as a developer. I'll start by covering some of the arguments on why you should consider using Svelte at all, and then I will follow up by showing some code examples of how to use Svelte. As I mentioned, Svelte has two main goals: runtime performance and developer ease. So let me go a bit into those 2 points. To put it simply, the fastest code you can run is the code that doesn't exist, and Svelte helps you produce less code. This means you don't have to send as many kilobytes of JavaScript over the wire, and it means that the JavaScript engine in the browser has to do less work, both of which leads to better performance. To achieve this, Svelte moves all of the heavy lifting to compile time, while other frameworks such as React or Vue ship a whole framework to parse templates in the browser. Svelte does this while compiling, effectively removing the need to ship any framework code to the browser. Svelte doesn't use a virtual DOM and diffing to update its views. Instead, it surgically updates the element that needs changing directly. You could compare this to how an Excel spreadsheet works. How an Excel spreadsheet works. If you set up a formula in a cell, that cell will be updated whenever the cells it depends on changes value. Excel keeps track of the dependency and makes sure to update the formula cell when needed. The alternative would be to iterate over all the cells in the spreadsheet and go over and check one by one to see if they need an update when a cell changes its value. And this is basically what React does. So this helps making Svelte apps slim and fast. But how does it make your life as a developer easier? Well, first off, it saves you from typing. By looking at Svelte and React codebases that implement the same app, Svelte apps typically has 40% fewer characters than its React counterpart. That doesn't only save on keystrokes, but also leads to fewer opportunities for bugs. Less code means most likely fewer bugs. Svelte cuts down on code by having a lot of small shortcuts that does what you want instead of having you to write it out over and over again. So I'll show you a few examples. For example, if we want to create some local state inside of a component, we just declare a variable like this. To render it in a view, you put the variable name inside of a single curly brace, and you update the value by assigning to it. Svelte will then automatically update the view with a new value whenever it changes. To store some global state, you can declare a store. This is a writable store, which means that the consumers of the store can update it. Sorry. You could subscribe to updates to the store by calling subscribe and then also remembering to unsubscribe once the component is destroyed. But Svelte has a shortcut for this, which is just a dollar sign. So if you refer to the store variable with a dollar sign in front, Svelte will hook up all these functions for you, so you don't have to do it yourself. By prefixing anything with $colon, you declare what comes after should be run whenever one of its dependencies are updated. So in this example, whenever the local state variable or the store value is updated, the filtered variable will be updated with a new value, and Svelte will update the view to show the new value. But let's have a look at some examples. So this is a small shopping list app that I put together, and we're going to have a look at some of it, not all of it. That's too much for such a short talk. But we're going to have a look at the list item component. As you can see, the user can click the left part of the list item to mark it as done or not done. And you can click the list item itself to edit its description and quantity. A Svelte component is a combination of three main parts. The script tag, which contains the logic of the component, a template written in HTML, and a style tag, which contains styling for the component. All code and styles defined inside of the component are scoped, meaning they will not collide with variables or styles defined outside of the component. So for our component, we need a reference to the item we're going to show. We can define a property on the list item component by exporting a local variable. So users of this component can now assign to a property with the name of item, and the value they pass in will now be available inside of the component. Then we want to show the item to the user. So we start by declaring some plain HTML, and then we put in some templating. So here we have an area for the user to click when they want to toggle the item as done or undone. We subscribe to a DOM event by using the on directive and specifying a handler. So here we're listening to click events on this element. We update the items is done property by assigning to it. This will make Svelte update the view. And in this case, that means a source attribute on this image tag. So it switches between two different SVGs that have different indications of whether or not the item is done. Next, we need the description of the item. This is also when we show the description with a single curly brace as before, and we show the quantity in its own span. We want to apply some special styling when the item is marked as done. By using the class directive, we can add a CSS class named is-done whenever the is-done property is set to true on item. I've omitted the CSS, but you could define this in the CSS style tag at the bottom of the component. We also want to support editing. So we introduce a local variable called editing to keep track of which state we're in. And we put the existing template inside of a if block to hide it when we're in editing mode. The template we want to show when we're editing, we put inside the else block. We add a click handler to the description to set the editing state. The handler sets the property editing to true, and it prepares the local state for editing. We could update the item directly, but we want to submit the changes only when the user is done editing to prevent it from reevaluating, sorting and everything while the user is typing. To access the value of the input fields, we use the bind directive, which will keep the value of the input field and the local variable in sync. We also add a key down event handler to stop editing when the user presses the enter key. We do this for both the description field and for the quantity field. Just below the input field for the description, we also want to show the department selection. We import the department select component at the top of the script tag, and we add it to just below the input field for the description. We bind the department property on the department select component to the local variable department. But since the local variable and the property on the component have the same name, we can shorten it to just this. No need to type the same thing over and over. Next, we want the department select component to slide in like it did in the example. We import one of the built-in transitions from Svelte. Then we add the transition directive to the element, which will make it transition from when it's added to the DOM and when it's removed from the DOM. But we only want the transition to happen when it's added to the DOM. So we'll use the in directive instead. There's also an out directive, which does the opposite part, where it animates when it is removed from the DOM. We can also set a custom duration for the transition to make it a bit more snappy. We have some double braces here because we're declaring a object literal directly inside the single brace. So it's not some kind of special syntax. We'll want to apply some styling when we're in editing mode. So we'll add the class directive and add the class editing when editing is set to true. And once again, since the name of the CSS class and the name of the local variable are the same, we can skip the curly braces. And this is our finished component, sans the CSS styling, which would be off screen at this point. And these are just some of the very handy features of Svelte. For more reading, I recommend the official Svelte site. And also the blog post introducing Svelte version 3, which explains a lot of the reasoning behind Svelte's design. Rich Harris, the creator of Svelte, has a talk called Rethinking Reactivity, which I can't recommend enough. Even if you don't end up using Svelte, it's a very good talk reflecting on the current state of front-end frameworks. There's also a great video from the series Learn with Jason, where Jason, which is a complete beginner to Svelte, learns Svelte while pair programming with its creator. And that's pretty much it for my talk.